popular movements, the Black Power movement, the Indian movement, feminists, the anti-war movement, we forget the environmental movement. The first Earth Day was in 1970, organized by Ralph Nader. The consumer rights movement, which of course Ralph ran. All of this was a time when we began to push back against entrenched systems of power. And then we got the counter-revolution. It really began in 1971 with the Powell memo. Lewis Powell, who was at that time the attorney for the Chamber of Commerce, was later appointed to the Supreme Court, laid out the kind of blueprint where the ruling elites would deal with what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called our excess of democracy. And that infusion, that actually Powell names Nader by name in terms of one of the targets, but we saw tremendous infusion of resources by the business and corporate elites into all of the institutions that had built alliances with these popular movements, academia, the church, the press, and we began to recreate a kind of corporate tyranny. John Ralston Saul calls what happened a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion. The leading civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, of course, and Malcolm X, understood that without economic justice, there could never be racial justice, that you could bring in a certain segment of the black bourgeoisie. Clarence Thomas would be a kind of perfect example to do the dirty work of both white supremacy and unfettered, unregulated capitalism. And of course, King, as you all know, was killed in Memphis in the midst of supporting a strike by sanitation workers. And I think this is very important because what the ruling elites were quite successful at doing was divorcing the issue of race from the issue of class. And they also created a kind of species of corporate colonialism where they brought in people of color willing to do their bidding and yet perpetuate the system. I think you could argue that for certainly African Americans in deindustrialized urban centers, economically, not just economically, but socially and even culturally, life is probably worse than when King marched in Selma. And so this process had two prongs. One, it essentially sought to eradicate any discussion of class, which was an extremely important understanding by the movements in the 1960s. And at the same time, it championed this rapacious neoliberalism, unfettered capitalism, whatever term you want to use, which saw the country deindustrialized. And huge sections of the working class were rendered redundant. And we'll talk about the differences between black urban centers and the white working class. They were both rendered redundant, but the forms of social control were very different. So as these Detroit and Newark and all of these inner cities were essentially stripped of any well-paying jobs, then you saw the infusion of militarized police and the massive expansion of the carceral state. And we have to acknowledge that this was done in large part by the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton. So it was Clinton, of course, that passed NAFTA, and Biden. Biden was an instrumental figure in the Senate at the time, pushing this through. And it was Clinton and Biden that really created this militarized police, what Malcolm X would call these internal armies of occupation, and exploded the prison population. We had about 700,000 prisoners when Clinton came into office. That had almost doubled by the time he left. Now it's 2.3 million. That is the 25% of the world's prison population, although we're less than 4%. And why? Why did you send militarized police that can kill with impunity, as we see repeatedly in story after story? George Floyd or Eric Garner. I mean, the list is kind of endless. It's because those became the forms of social control. Emil Durkheim, the great sociologist, when he writes his book on suicide, asks, what is it that drives individuals and societies to commit self-destructive acts? And he targets social bonds. And he said, with a rupture of these social bonds, all of these mechanisms that integrate you into a society, when those are gone, then people lash out in ways that are self-destructive. So that would be, of course, suicide was his main focus, but also self-destructive behavior, gambling, of course, the opioid crisis, sexual sadism. We are a completely pornified society. Right-wing hate groups. It's interesting that Durkheim argues that the lust for the annihilation of the other is driven by a desire for self-annihilation. So people are pushed into these very dark pathologies. And then, of course, when you strip meaningful employment out of any community, what you're doing is pushing a very large segment of that community in order to survive into the illegal economy, the underground economy. And that's where we got the 3 strikes you're out law. I've been teaching in the New Jersey prisons since 2010, and I will periodically teach students who have life sentences, and they were never charged with committing a violent crime. It's all drugs. Aside from that, we have a broken judicial system. Excuse me, 20 or 94% of all of the people in our prison system are forced to plea out. Coerced is a better word, to plea out. And the way they are coerced to plea out to sentences that are 2 to 3 times longer than they are anywhere else in the world is that they're stacked with all sorts of charges that they didn't commit. Now, the police know that they didn't commit them. The prosecutors know they didn't commit them. But those are used as bargaining chips. So the students that I teach in the prison who have the longest sentences are invariably the ones who went to trial, and sadly the ones who almost always didn't commit the crime and believed naively that the system would validate their innocence. In fact, they, by going to trial with a public attorney who maybe spends 10 or 15 minutes on their case, serve sentences that are far longer than others who took the plea, and that's a kind of example. So you had, what Marx calls this surplus population, this redundant labor. You needed effective forms of social control, and those became occupation forces, many of them modeled on the kind of occupation forces on the outer reaches of empire. I would argue that a night raid in Oakland doesn't look any different from a night raid in Fallujah. Doors are kicked in at 2 in the morning. SWAT teams are carrying long-barreled weapons with Kevlar vests, terrorizing the people inside. And this, of course, is what always happens in a declining empire. Thucydides writes about it on the Peloponnesian War, that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. So you create this kind of judicial, policing, carceral mechanism to contain poor people of color, primarily. Of course, that is the disproportionate number of those in our prison population. But what has been visited on people of color in former urban industrial centers has also been inflicted on the white working class. So in my book, America, the Farewell Tour, I was in Anderson, Indiana. Anderson, Indiana was one of the major production points for GM cars. 25,000 unionized jobs. After NAFTA, those plants were packed up and moved to Monterrey, Mexico, where Mexican workers are paid $3 an hour without benefits to do the same work. And then because of trade deals, these vehicles cross the Mexican border back into the United States. So Anderson went into the kind of tailspin that you see in many urban centers. Of course, there was an explosion in the opioid crisis, suicides. The largest, statistically, the largest number of, or the category that has the largest number of suicides in the United States are middle-aged white men. I think that gets back to an essay James Baldwin wrote where he talked about why black men didn't have a midlife crisis the way white men did, because black men understood the game was fixed from childhood on. But white men could believe the myth until, of course, they were cast aside. So you go to Anderson, and it looks like, many of the kind of post-industrial centers around the country. The churches are boarded up. When I was reporting there, the supermarket in the poorest part of town was actually closing, which meant, especially if you didn't have a car, this is quite difficult. The closest supermarket were miles away. I wrote in Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt out of West Virginia. There weren't any supermarkets at all. People had to buy their food at gas stations, at convenience stores. It was all, fast food. I mean, and then with all the attendant health problems that come with eating junk. And what I was spent a lot of time with the old UAW workers in Anderson, and what was interesting is this was during the election of 2016. Most of them voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, but in the general election they voted for Trump, and they voted for Trump because they were acutely aware of what Bill Clinton and the Democratic leadership had done, how by pushing through NAFTA, along with a series of other measures, destroying the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act that put up a firewall between investment and commercial banks, deregulating the FCC, destroying welfare. I mean, we shouldn't forget that it was the Clinton administration that destroyed our welfare system, and 70% of the original recipients on welfare were children. And I think the Democrats were completely blind to the anger and the legitimate anger. In terms of voting, I think we have to also acknowledge that because of the criminalization in urban centers, we have stripped millions of people have been stripped of their right to vote because of felony convictions. That's something that a lot of my students who have gotten out are now organizing to help overcome. But when it's one step forward and two steps back, as we saw in Florida and other states. So this economic crisis, I think, is extremely important to understanding the dynamics of race in the United States. So what happened with the white working class is that they were repeatedly told by right-wing demagogues and these kind of neo-Christian fascists that have now controlled the Republican Party, that their well-being, their lives, the future of their families were sacrificed to help or to assist or to give aid to poor people of color, or all of those liberal groups that become kind of targets for the right wing. Of course, statistically, this isn't true. I mean, African American families since the 2008 crash have suffered economically far more grievously than white families. But at this point, what you're doing, with this kind of fake news is responding to an emotional need. It's not rational. Of course, racism is never rational. And if you respond to that emotional need, Trump was very good at this, then facts don't matter. And that gets to the issue of where we are with race. It is extremely important for the ruling elites. The concentration of wealth by this oligarchic elite is unlike anything we've ever seen in American history. If you look at the fortunes amassed by oligarchs of previous generations, it's nothing compared to the fortunes that have been amassed today. So when David Rockefeller died, I think he was worth about $3 billion. Even the worst kleptocrats, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, I think were worth about $10 billion. But today we have figures like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, who each are worth over $200 billion. This concentration of wealth, Aristotle writes about it and correctly points to it as extremely dangerous. He said that when wealth is concentrated in, he calls them an aristocratic elite like that, then Aristotle says you only have two choices, that's tyranny or revolution. So what we have seen are, I think, two, very frightening trajectories. The Republican Party, which there was just an article in the Times yesterday about the Democrats meeting for a retreat, and many of them being, of course, deeply despondent because of the paralysis of the Biden administration, and saying that it's extremely likely now that the Republicans will take over both the House and the Senate, and leaving, as Biden said, his single prerogative essentially being a veto, the ability to veto. And so on the one hand, you have the Democratic Party, which is funded, of course, by corporate elites, which it cannot alienate. However well-meaning, I think there are figures in the Democratic Party who are well-meaning, they remain paralyzed because of our money-saturated elections. Remember, Clinton raised $1 billion for the presidential campaign. So they're so beholden to these interests that they can't push through the kinds of reforms. The Build Back Better bill is completely gutted. They can't push through the kinds of reforms that would address this kind of alienation and suffering on both throughout the working class and among the working poor. And so the reactions are different. Within urban centers with poor people of color, we've largely criminalized the ability of black people to have guns in the United States, especially if you live in an urban center. My family's from Maine. The guy across the road from us has 23 weapons. These aren't just, it's not for hunting. I used to hunt. I'm a vegan now, but I grew up hunting. And AR-15s are useless as hunting rifles. The caliber of the bullet is too small unless you want to put 20 bullets in a deer or something. They're designed to kill people. That's it. And you have, I don't know, we don't know the exact figure, but 1.5 million, 2 million of these weapons are in hands. And of course, then we have all the nihilistic school shootings and mall shootings and everything else. So you have among a dispossessed and enraged white working class, you've weaponized it. You've fed it with these non-reality based conspiracy theories to essentially give them a vent for their anger. Richard Rorty wrote a book quite prescient book. I think he wrote it in '98 called Achieving Our Country. And he talks about how all the sadism that the liberal elites attempted to address within the society, particularly among the white society, is going to come back with a vengeance. And that all the old racist tropes and overt bigotry will essentially be back within the mainstream. And that, of course, is precisely what happened. The upcoming elections, I think, are important. I don't think it was accidental that figures like Stacey Abrams and other voting rights campaigners in Georgia did not show up to the Biden event when he was there, because the Biden White House, other than kind of rhetorically, has not responded to this very concerted Republican effort to redistrict and gerrymander in a way that will ensure that poor people and people of color have really no voice in the electoral process. Unfortunately, this kind of redistricting is not exclusive to the Republican Party. My friend Dennis Kucinich, who was in the House, had his district gerrymandered by the Democratic elite in Ohio so that he would lose his House seat, which he did. He just ran in November for the mayor of Cleveland. He had been the mayor of Cleveland. He was ahead in the polls until 3 weeks before the election. And then you saw massive amounts of dark money, corporate money, coming into the system and, of course, putting in a pro-corporate candidate. So we've divorced the issue of class and race, and this serves the interest of the ruling elites because they are always able to find figures, Ben Carson, I mean, you know, there's no shortage of them, who fulfill the race requirement but serve this system of white supremacy and unfettered capitalism. So they can talk about race, but they can't talk about race and class. And as we kind of barrel forwards, the inability on the part of this Democratic administration to address the dislocation and disenfranchisement means that that will become exacerbated. As was mentioned in the introduction, I wrote a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I did not use the term fascist lightly. I, of course, have a seminary degree. I grew up in the church. For me, these are Christian heretics. You don't need to, as I did, spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School to recognize that Jesus didn't come to make us rich, that Jesus would not bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs up and down the Middle East, that Jesus did not see the white race. Jesus, by the way, wasn't white. Jesus was a person of color. The Romans were white. But he didn't bless the white race, especially the American white race, to carry out the Christian project. This is just an anathema. It's a complete distortion of the Bible, and part of my frustration with the liberal church, which I come out of, is that it didn't call these people out for who they are in the name of tolerance, which is a word Martin Luther King never used, and essentially gave them a kind of religious legitimacy. I was very influenced by a great scholar at Harvard, James Luther Adams, Unitarian, who he was 80 when I had him. He had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936. He was bilingual in German at the University of Heidelberg. He was at lectures where Martin Heidegger actually began the lectures with the Nazi salute. He dropped out. He joined the Confessing Church led by Niemöller, later Bonhoeffer. I think Bonhoeffer went in 35 and 36, may have still been a Union Theological. But Albert Schweitzer, he knew all these people, Karl Barth, and he saw it was a very nascent movement when I was in divinity school in the early 80s, but he saw in that movement a parallel to the so-called German Christian Church, which was pro-Nazi and which had fused the kind of symbols of the Nazi Party, the iconography of the Nazi Party, with the symbols and iconography of the Christian religion. And I remember him telling, he was certainly one of the most brilliant professors I ever had, but I remember him telling us that when we were his age, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. And that's, of course, what we've come down to. The ideological void of Donald Trump, who's, of course, as we all know, just a narcissist and a megalomaniac, was filled by the ideology of the Christian right. And, of course, he brought many of these figures, Mike Pence, Betsy DeVos, Ben Carson, Mike Pompeo, into the centers of power, but not just at the senior level, but throughout the system, recruiting out of these parallel institutions that had been created by the Christian right, Liberty University, Patrick Henry Law School, etc. And for me, having spent 2 years with this group, the Christian right is the heir to the KKK, which, as Paxton, who wrote The Anatomy of Fascism, wrote, was our most authentically fascist movement. Remember, every KKK chapter had a chaplain. They began with a prayer. They set up a kind of altar with a Christian cross and usually a Bible and a gun on it. And so that strain of kind of Christian fascism is not something that just erupted with Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell, but it's long been embedded within white America, because it is the kind of religious expression of white supremacy. And so, just to close, I'll raise, where do we go? How do we respond? I think, first of all, we have to address the fundamental issue of class dislocation if we're ever going to address the accelerated expressions of racism that are gripping our very troubled society. And that's got to be done, I think, by finding or making common cause with those movements, whether it's Starbucks workers or Amazon workers, that are pushing back against corporate capitalism. So in my students in the prison who are earning their degree through Rutgers University, some of them finish the degree in prison, but if they are released and they haven't finished the degree and they have a 3.1 average, they can matriculate to Rutgers. And a lot of my students, very, very bright, talented men and women, I've taught in the women's prison in New Jersey too, they got to Rutgers and they've been organizing the food service workers, the maintenance workers at Rutgers. They're black, they're all black. But what's interesting, they're telling me, is that what they're doing, they're organizing workers who are Trump supporters. And I think that is where it goes. I think that when you begin to, and of course any successful labor movement is not just about protecting workers' rights, but it's about education. It's about explaining how power works. And so there is a kind of process of enlightenment that comes with it. What was it, Lord Salisbury, who said, there's no permanent allies, there's only permanent power. That's a line Saul Alinsky liked to use. But I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to grasp that it's not just the racist dog whistles and tropes that emanate daily from the Republican Party that have to be fought, but it's also the rapacious assault by corporate forces that have distorted the world and fed this kind of racism, because entities like Fox News or Newsmax, all these right-wing places are never going to confront the real centers of power. They are always going to try to focus on scapegoats, and those that we know what that list looks like. It's the same list for any fascist or neo-fascist movement. It's blacks, it's undocumented people, it's LGBTQ people, it's liberals, it's intellectuals, it's artists, real journalists. Those are always the targets. And I worry deeply. I think that Biden in many ways may have been our last chance to halt a rising kind of authoritarianism. I think the Democratic Party has failed us in terms of not intervening aggressively to block the very heavy-handed tactics that are being used by a Republican Party that at this point has no pretense of even being democratic institutions. I mean, they're trying to get state attorney generals in power who will oversee the vote count, who believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. So the Republicans have always been a minority. I mean, we forget these figures like Trump, George W. Bush. They didn't win with a plurality because of the Electoral College. What did Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Trump, and Trump's president. So the system is distorted politically. The system is distorted economically. But I think the most important issue that I want to stress today is that we are not going to address the cancer of racism in this country, which is reaching frightening levels, unless we also address the issue of class. Thank you. Trump's president. So the system is distorted politically. The